A blizzard screams over the San Juan Mountains. In a derelict truck, buried in the snow, a German Shepherd K9 named Maverick digs frantically. He's found a 5-year-old boy, blue and silent, left for dead by the one person who should have protected him. The air is ice. The boy's jacket is thin. And in a nearby rock crevice, a Paw Patrol backpack holds a terrible secret. Miles away, behind a perfect smile, at a ski lodge, a villain believes his plan is flawless. He's about to inherit a fortune, but he didn't count on a grieving retired K9 cop, a man who knows what it's like to lose everything. The killer's alibi is perfect. The police are searching in the wrong place. The only thing that can break the case is not a camera, but the scent of a lie that a trained K9 will never ignore. And when Maverick stands between that boy and the man who returns to finish the job, the cabin will shift from a shelter to a courtroom, from fear to justice. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and the guardians God sends in the storm. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. If you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Telluride wasn't just experiencing winter, it was being erased by it. The town itself, nestled deep in its box canyon, was a distant flicker of expensive lights, but up here, on the high ridges where the asphalt turned to gravel and the gravel turned to nothing, the world was a violent vortex of white. The blizzard had been assaulting the San Juan Mountains for 2 days straight, a shrieking, relentless force that buried roads, snapped power lines, and forced every living creature, man or beast, into hiding. Every living creature, that is, except the one whose job it had been to never hide. Inside a small, heavily reinforced A-frame cabin, the only structure for miles, sat Silas Thorne. At 52, the mountains and his grief had carved him into something as stark and weathered as the granite peaks outside. He was a tall man, broad in the shoulders from a life of physical work, but he held himself with a stillness that bordered on invisibility. His face was all sharp angles and deep-set eyes the color of a frozen lake, and a beard, thick and untrimmed, had long since surrendered to gray, more salt than pepper. Silas had been a K9 officer in Denver for 25 years, a man who lived by instinct and evidence, a man who trusted his partner above all else. He had retired early, or perhaps just fled, 3 years ago, following the quiet, sterile death of his wife, Clara, a slow-moving sickness that had been a different kind of fire he couldn't put out. He had chased criminals and tracked fugitives while the real thief, insidious and microscopic, stalked the halls of his own home. The guilt of that imbalance had driven him here, to this self-imposed prison of snow and silence, where the only person he had to fail was himself. His only partner now was Maverick, a 7-year-old German Shepherd, lying with a heavy sigh by the wood-burning stove. Maverick was a specimen of his breed, 90 pounds of disciplined muscle, sable-coated with a deep black saddle and intelligent, perpetually alert eyes. He wasn't a pet, he was a partner in retirement, a colleague who had seen as much darkness as Silas and bore it with a quieter dignity. Maverick had been Silas's K9, a dual-purpose dog trained in both apprehension and narcotics. He was, by nature, a weapon. But here in the cabin, he was just a presence, a warm body, a living testament to a life Silas had abandoned. The storm roared, and the cabin groaned under the weight of the accumulating snow. Silas stared into the flames, his thoughts drifting back, as they always did. His gaze drifted to the mantel, to the single-framed photo of Clara, her smile bright and vibrant, taken years before the illness hollowed her cheeks. He had been tracking a fugitive in the foothills when she collapsed. He had made the arrest, but he had missed the most important call of his life. The silence of the cabin was his penance. Suddenly that silence was broken. It wasn't the wind or the fire. Maverick's head snapped up from his paws, his ears swiveling like radar dishes. A low, resonant growl rumbled in his chest, a sound Silas hadn't heard in months. "Easy, Mav," Silas murmured, his voice rough from disuse. "It's just the wind." He looked at the window, which was now just a solid pane of white. Nothing's moving in this, probably a mountain lion scenting the chimney smoke, but Maverick didn't settle. He rose to his feet in a single fluid motion, his body tensing. He stalked to the heavy oak door, sniffing intently at the threshold where the blizzard forced icy drafts through the seals. The growl deepened, becoming more urgent. He let out a single, sharp bark. "Hey," Silas said, standing up. "What is it?" Maverick looked back at him, his eyes intense, and then returned to the door, whining now, a frantic sound that grated on Silas's nerves. "Damn it, Maverick, stand down," Silas commanded, using the old tone. In Denver, that word would have made the dog drop to his belly instantly. Here, Maverick ignored it. He began to paw at the door, his claws scraping the wood. "It's nothing," Silas snapped, his own irritation rising. But he knew his dog. This wasn't agitation. This was an alert. This was work. Before Silas could react further, Maverick did the unthinkable. He backed up, gathered his powerful haunches, and slammed his 90-pound body against the door. The latch, designed to keep the wind out, not a K9 in, rattled in its strike plate. "Maverick, no!" Silas shouted. With a second impact, the latch splintered, and the heavy door flew open, ripped from Silas's grasp by the vacuum of the storm. The wind and snow exploded into the cabin, extinguishing the lantern on the table and sending embers scattering from the stove. And Maverick, without hesitation, bolted into the white void. "Maverick! God damn it!" Silas roared into the deafening wind. He stumbled to the broken doorway, shielding his eyes. The dog was already gone, a dark shape swallowed by the blizzard in seconds. Cursing, frantic, Silas knew he had no choice. You don't let your partner go into the dark alone. Not ever. Pulling on his heavy-duty parka, grabbing a high-powered flashlight, and clipping a snow shovel to his pack, Silas stepped out into the tempest. The wind stole his breath. It was like stepping into a solid wall of ice particles. Visibility was less than 5 feet. "Maverick!" he yelled, but the name was stolen from his lips. He could barely see his own boots. Panic, cold and sharp, pricked at him. This was how people died. But then, through the chaos, he heard it. A sharp, commanding bark, carried back by the wind. It was Maverick, somewhere to the north, on the old logging spur. Following the dog was an act of faith. He pushed through drifts that were already waist-deep, his flashlight beam cutting a pathetic cone in the swirling snow. He kept walking, trusting the intermittent barks, for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 minutes. He was nearly a mile from the cabin when Maverick stopped barking. Silas's heart hammered. Had a cat cornered him? Had he fallen? He pushed faster, calling the dog's name, and nearly fell over him. Maverick was in the middle of the old, forgotten logging road, digging furiously at a drift that wasn't just a drift. It had shape. It was too uniform. Silas shone his light on it, and his blood ran cold. The drift had collected against something else, something man-made. He brushed the snow away and felt cold metal. It wasn't a rock. He realized he was looking at the roofline of an ancient derelict pickup truck, one that had been abandoned on this spur road decades ago, a local landmark for hikers in the summer. Now, it was almost completely buried. Maverick was clawing at the driver's side door, his paws bloodying the snow. "What is it, boy? What did you find?" Silas pushed the dog aside and began digging with his hands, then his shovel, clearing the snow from the side of the vehicle. The wind howled, trying to undo his work as fast as he did it. He finally cleared the door handle and the frozen glass. He wiped snow from the window and shone his light inside. He saw nothing but shadow and frost. "Maverick, back!" Silas wedged the shovel into the doorframe, using all his weight to pry it open against the ice. With a piercing groan of tortured metal, the door broke free and swung open, and the storm's roar was replaced by a single, sharp intake of Silas's own breath. Curled on the cracked vinyl bench seat, wearing only a thin parka and jeans, was a child, a little boy, perhaps 5 years old, his face pale, his lips a shocking shade of blue. He was unconscious, but as Silas pressed 2 trembling fingers to the boy's neck, he felt it, a faint, thready pulse, a flicker of life in the absolute zero of the void. There was no thought, only a roaring resurgence of instinct. The pulse, faint as a moth's wing under his trembling fingers, triggered 25 years of training. Silas Thorne was no longer a grieving recluse. He was an officer, and this was a victim. He ripped off his own parka, the freezing air instantly attacking his base layers, and wrapped the child in its insulated bulk. He scooped the impossibly light body against his chest, a bundle of frozen limbs that felt more like wood than flesh. "Maverick, with me, home!" he roared, the command cutting through the wind. The trek back was a brutal, lung-searing fight. The storm, as if angered by this theft from its grasp, fought him for every step. He shielded the boy with his own body, turning his back to the wind, following the dark, kinetic shape of his K9, who plowed a path through the fresh drifts. The half-mile return felt like 10. He kicked the shattered remnant of his door open and stumbled inside, the wind howling at his back before he managed to slam and rebolt the splintered wood. The cabin was a chaotic mess of snow, embers, and overturned furniture. He didn't care. He laid the child on the hearthrug before the stove, the only source of reliable warmth. "Lights, Mav," he ordered. The dog, trained for myriad tasks, located the pull cord on the battery-powered lantern and tugged it, flooding the small room with a harsh, sterile light. The boy, Leo, was inert, his skin a waxy, grayish blue. His thin jacket and jeans were stiff with ice. Silas's hands, clumsy with cold, fumbled for his trauma shears. He cut the frozen clothes from the small body with practiced efficiency, revealing skin mottled with the terrifying red and white patches of severe hypothermia. He saw old faded bruises on the boy's ribs and a newer purplish mark on his small wrist, but his brain filed the information away. Later, survival first. He grabbed the driest, warmest blankets he owned, Clara's old wool throws, and wrapped the boy tightly, not rubbing, his training screaming at him that rubbing frozen tissue could destroy it. He cranked the stove's flue open, risking a chimney fire to get a roaring blaze. He was on autopilot, his hands moving with a purpose they hadn't felt in years, a stark, painful contrast to the agonizing helplessness he'd felt as Clara's life slipped away in a clean, quiet hospital room. That had been a slow, invisible decay he couldn't fight. This was a physical enemy. This he knew. For an hour, he was a machine. He heated water and broth on the stove, carefully, ensuring it was only warm, not hot. He forced his own body to stop shaking as he sat beside the small, blanket-wrapped form, waiting for any sign. Maverick didn't settle. The dog paced the perimeter of the room, a restless, whining sentinel, his senses clearly overwhelmed. He would stop, sniff the air, and return to the child's side, nudging the blankets with his nose, as if to check for life himself. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the boy's eyelids flickered. He didn't wake with a cry, but with a sudden, silent gasp. His eyes, a deep dark blue, snapped open and fixed on Silas. And what Silas saw in them made his blood run colder than the blizzard had. It was pure, unadulterated terror. The child didn't make a sound. He didn't cry or scream. He just watched Silas, his small body vibrating with fear, his gaze darting between Silas's large, bearded face and the cabin door. He was a cornered animal. "Hey," Silas said, his voice a low gravel, instinctively softening it. "You're safe. You're warm now." He held up his hands slowly, showing they were empty. "I'm not going to hurt you." The words were useless. The boy flinched, pulling the wool blanket up to his chin, his eyes wide and unblinking. Silas, a large, imposing man who had used his size to intimidate criminals, now saw himself through the boy's eyes. A bearded giant in a dark, isolated cabin. He was the monster in the story. He backed away slowly, giving the boy space. Okay, I'm just going to sit over here." He retreated to his chair, but the boy's eyes followed his every move. Maverick, however, seemed to understand the impasse. The big German shepherd padded slowly to the hearth and lay down, not facing the boy, but parallel to him, offering his flank. He let out a low, long-suffering groan, as if to say, "This man is an idiot, but I'm here." He rested his head on his paws, watching the boy sideways. Silas tried again. He poured some of the warm, weak broth into a mug and slid it gently across the floor toward the hearth. "You need to drink this. It'll help." The boy stared at the mug as if it were poison, then back at Silas. He made no move. After a full minute of tense silence, Maverick lifted his head. He nudged the mug with his nose, pushing it an inch closer to the boy's cocoon of blankets. The boy's gaze shifted from Silas to the dog. He watched Maverick, his small brow furrowed. The dog whined, a soft, questioning sound, and nudged the mug again. Slowly, agonizingly, a tiny, chapped hand emerged from the blankets. It didn't reach for the mug. It reached for the dog. The small fingers, still red with cold, buried themselves in the thick, sable fur of Maverick's neck. The dog didn't flinch, just closed his eyes and leaned into the touch, a silent, solid anchor. The boy's body, which had been rigid with terror, seemed to deflate, just slightly. He kept his grip on Maverick's fur and, with his other hand, shakily pulled the mug closer. He sipped the broth, his eyes never leaving Silas, still wary, still terrified, but now he was tethered to the one thing in the room that made sense. Silas sat back, his heart aching. This was worse than finding him. The boy wasn't just lost, he was broken. Just then, the cabin's remaining lights flickered and died, the generator outside finally surrendering to the storm. The radio in the corner, which had been crackling with static, let out a final, dying squawk and went silent. The blizzard had won. The power was gone. The roads were impassable. The radio was dead. There was no one coming. He was alone, trapped by the storm with a silent, traumatized child who was terrified of him, and a dog who had just become the sole guardian of a life Silas had saved, but had no idea how to heal. The silence that followed the generator's death was heavier, somehow, than the storm's roar. The cabin was plunged into a primal darkness, lit only by the flickering, demonic orange of the stove's firebox. The wind, no longer just a sound, felt like a physical entity trying to breach the walls. Silas didn't move for a full minute. He was trapped, miles from civilization, responsible for a traumatized child who wouldn't speak, with no power and no communication. The boy, Leo, made a small hitching sound, the first noise Silas had heard from him, a gasp of pure fear. In the dim firelight, Silas saw the boy's small hands clutching Maverick's fur so tightly his knuckles were white. The dog, a creature of pure instinct, did nothing. He didn't pull away, he didn't move, he simply absorbed the child's terror, a solid living anchor in the chaos. That one, simple act of stillness was something Silas couldn't offer. He felt the old, familiar weight of failure settle on his shoulders. He couldn't save Clara. Now he was trapped with a child who saw him as the enemy. The night became a long, waking vigil. Silas took the watch, as he had 1,000 times in a squad car, but this time his only duty was to the fire. He fed the stove logs every hour, keeping the cabin from plunging into the lethal cold, his movements slow and deliberate so as not to startle the boy. Leo never slept. He remained on the hearth, his eyes tracking Silas's shadow, his lifeline a 90-pound German shepherd who had not moved an inch. The dawn broke not with light, but with silence. The wind, which had howled for nearly 48 hours, stopped. It didn't taper off. It simply ceased, as if a switch had been thrown. The sudden, profound quiet was jarring. Silas rose from his chair, his joints cracking. He looked out the one window he'd managed to clear. The world was gone, replaced by a new, pristine landscape of impossible sculptural drifts. The sun, when it finally crested the peaks, was blinding, reflecting off 1 billion crystals. It was beautiful, and it was a tomb, but the silence meant the atmospheric pressure had changed. It meant he had a chance. "I'm going outside," Silas said, his voice low, "just for a minute, to check the antenna." The boy only pressed his face deeper into Maverick's ruff. Silas geared up and stepped outside. The air was frigid, thin, and sharp. He found what he expected. The heavy, wet snow had snapped at the coax cable for his old shortwave radio, tearing it clean from the mast. He spent an hour in the biting cold, his fingers numb, splicing the wire and reinforcing the connection. It was a soldier's repair, ugly but functional. Back inside, he went to the corner, to the dusty, obsolete piece of equipment that was his only link to the world. He fired it up, the cabin filled with the hiss and crackle of static. He began working the dial, scanning the emergency frequencies. "Repeat. All plows are ground until skid steer needed. On." The static was a wall. Then he caught a clear signal. "Telluride dispatch. This is Navarro, running radio check. All quiet." Silas grabbed the mic, his heart hammering. "Telluride dispatch. This is Thorne. Do you copy?" The static roared, and then a voice, sharp and clear, cut through. "Silas, my God, is that you? We've had you listed as unresponsive since the storm hit. Are you okay?" The voice belonged to Deputy Kate Navarro. She was 32, a Telluride local, lean and practical with sharp, intelligent eyes and dark hair pulled back in a functional braid. She'd been a rookie when Silas was still a legend in Denver, and she held a deep, almost familial respect for him. But she was also too smart to be intimidated by anyone. "I'm functional, Kate. The generator's dead, but I'm okay. I have a situation here." He explained it, quickly, professionally. "I have a found child, male, approximately 5 years old. Found him a mile from my cabin. Hypothermic, but stable now. He's in my care. The silence on the radio was absolute. For a second, Silas thought the connection had dropped. Silas, Kate said finally, her voice suddenly stripped of all familiarity, now pure cop. Repeat that. I have a found child, Silas said, his patience thinning. Leo, he won't speak. I need you to run. Silas, stop, Kate interrupted, her voice tight. I'm running every bulletin. County, state, amber. There are no missing children. I mean it. Not in Telluride, not in the state. No one is looking for a 5-year-old boy. A cold dread settled in Silas's stomach, far colder than the storm. This wasn't a child who wandered off from a ski lesson. This was something else. He was in the old pickup, the derelict on the North Spur. Jesus, Kate breathed. Silas, that road's been impassable for months. No one goes there. Are you sure? I'm sure, he said, his eyes turning to the boy, who was watching him, still silent. Kate, this wasn't an accident. He was left. Stay put, Kate commanded. The plows are starting, but the high-altitude roads are last. I'll get the department snowmobile. I can be there in 2 hours, maybe 3. Don't touch anything else. Just stay put. The call ended. 2 hours. He looked at the boy, then at the door. He couldn't wait. A cop's instinct was itching inside him, the one he'd tried to bury. He knew the scene needed to be processed before Kate arrived, before the snow melted, before the tracks were gone. He couldn't leave the boy. He also couldn't take him back into that cold. He was trapped. Then he looked at Maverick. He didn't have to choose. He went to the boy, who flinched. I have to go back to that truck, Silas said, his voice gentle. Maverick has to come with me. He's the only one who can find anything. The boy's eyes widened in panic. His grip on the dog's fur tightened. No, Silas said, anticipating the fear. You're coming too. We all go. He bundled Leo in the warmest gear he had, a makeshift cocoon, and settled the boy on his own shoulders, the child's legs wrapped around his neck. He armed himself and opened the door. Maverick, he said. Seek. The trek was slow. The snow was deep, but Maverick, now in his element, cut a path. When they reached the truck, it was stark and ugly in the bright sun. Silas set Leo down on a dry, windswept rock, wrapped in a blanket. Maverick, guard, he ordered. The dog instantly stood between Leo and the world, a silent, furry wall. Silas did a 360-degree sweep. He found faint, almost invisible tracks near the truck, nearly erased by the blizzard, a single set of adult boot prints, a large, expensive brand, leading away from the truck, toward the spot where a vehicle might have been parked before the road became impassable. Then he commanded Maverick, find it! The dog didn't go to the truck. He went to the tracks, his nose to the snow, and then veered off, plunging into a rocky crevice 20 yards away. He began to dig, not at snow, but at loose rocks. Silas followed. There, shoved deep into the cleft, was a child's backpack, a bright blue Paw Patrol backpack. He opened it. Inside, a single, empty water bottle, a small, damp pair of socks, and a man's leather wallet. Silas opened the wallet. The driver's license was pristine. Marcus Slade, a man in his early 40s, with a perfectly styled haircut, a blindingly white smile, and the cold, confident eyes of a salesman. And behind the license, a folded set of papers. It was a medical intake form from the Denver General Hospital. Patient name, Aria Davenport. Status, comatose. Silas Thorne stared at the items in his hand, the sun glinting off the plastic of the driver's license, making the smiling face of Marcus Slade look obscenely cheerful. Comatose. The word, printed on the hospital form, hung in the frigid, silent air, heavy and absolute. The pieces clicked into place with the cold, hard snap of a rifle bolt being seated. This wasn't negligence. This wasn't a panicked parent abandoning a child. This was a disposal. The faint adult boot prints leading away from the truck weren't tracks of flight. They were tracks of departure, of a task completed. He looked over at the small boy, Leo, who was watching him from his perch on the rock, his small face pale, his eyes wide in the blinding snow. The child was a loose end. Silas, with a grim set to his jaw, carefully placed the wallet and the papers back into the Paw Patrol backpack. He zipped it, his movements methodical. He was no longer a recluse. He was a custodian of evidence. He slung the backpack over his own shoulder, a heavy, sickening weight. He walked back to the boy, who flinched as he approached, his small body tensing. "It's time to go," Silas said, his voice a low rumble. He didn't try to soften it. The time for gentle placation was over. The world had just become infinitely more dangerous. He lifted the boy onto his shoulders. "Maverick, watch our back." The trek back to the cabin was different. The first time, Silas had been fighting the elements. Now, he was fighting the gnawing paranoia of a seasoned cop. His head was on a swivel, scanning the silent, snow-laden ridges, the dark lines of spruce trees, the impossible vistas. The beauty of the landscape now looked like a million places to hide, a million places to watch from. He wasn't just carrying a foundling, he was carrying a witness. Marcus Slade had a face, a name, and a motive that was rapidly taking shape in Silas's mind. A comatose wife, a small child who was likely the barrier to, what? Money? Freedom? It didn't matter. The man had left a 5-year-old boy in a metal tomb to freeze to death, counting on the blizzard to act as his accomplice. He hadn't counted on a retired K9 with a world-class nose. Back inside the cabin, the atmosphere was thick. Silas rebolted the splintered door and wedged a chair under the knob. He gave Leo more warm broth and a piece of jerky, which the boy gnawed on mechanically, his gaze fixed on Maverick. The dog had reassumed his position on the hearth, a furry barrier between the child and the room. 2 hours later, a new sound breached the silence. Not the wind, but the high-pitched, angry whine of a 2-stroke engine. Maverick's head snapped up, a low growl starting in his chest. "Easy," Silas murmured, moving to the window. "That's our ride." A moment later, a blue and white official snowmobile crested the ridge and slid to a halt near the cabin. The rider dismounted in one fluid motion. Deputy Kate Navarro was, as Silas remembered, all lean efficiency. She was 32, with dark, intelligent eyes and a single practical braid pulled back from a face that was sharp with focus. She wore a standard-issue insulated uniform, her sidearm strapped to her thigh, a tactical efficiency about her that belied the small-town setting. She was carrying a heavy-duty radio and a trauma kit. "Silas," she called out, her voice crisp. "You and the boy okay?" Silas opened the door, Maverick standing stiffly at his side until Silas gave the quiet stand command. Kate entered, her gaze sweeping the room, the splintered door, Silas's grim face, and finally, the small boy by the fire. Her professional mask softened for a half-second. "Jesus, Si, you weren't kidding." She knelt, keeping her distance. "Hey there, bud. I'm Kate. I'm a police officer. You're safe." Leo just stared, his hand buried in Maverick's fur. "He hasn't said a word," Silas said, getting straight to the point. "He's terrified, but that's not the half of it." "What do you mean?" Kate stood, turning her full attention to him. "There's no report." Silas pointed to the table. "You're not looking for the right person." He wasn't lost. He was left. He placed the blue backpack on the table and unzipped it. He laid out the wallet and the medical papers. Kate frowned, pulling off her gloves. She picked up the wallet, opened it, and froze. Her entire demeanor shifted. The color drained from her face, and her eyes, sharp before, were now like ice. "Silas," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Where in God's name did you get this?" "Rocky crevice, 20 yards from the truck. Hidden," Silas said. "Why? You know him?" "Know him?" Kate let out a harsh, incredulous breath. "Silas, the entire state knows him. This is Marcus Slade. And this," she said, her fingers touching the medical form, "is Aria Davenport." She looked up, her face grim. "Aria Davenport is Denver royalty. Tech money. She's been in a coma at Denver General for 2 months. Her car went off a scenic overlook on 70. Brakes failed. No skid marks. It was suspicious, but the investigation stalled." Silas felt the last piece of the puzzle lock into place. "And Marcus Slade, the new husband," Kate said, her voice laced with contempt, "married her 6 months ago. He's been playing the grieving husband to the media ever since. And Leo is her son, from her first marriage, her sole heir." A sickening silence filled the cabin. Silas looked at the boy, who was watching the adults, his small face a mask of confusion. "He tried to kill him," Silas stated. "It wasn't a question. He brought him up here, waited for the storm, dumped him in that derelict, and figured the blizzard would be his alibi," Kate agreed, her mind clearly racing. "He'd report him missing, a tragic accident, a kid wandering off from the ski slopes." She stopped, her eyes widening in horror. She fumbled for the radio on her tactical vest. "Dispatch, this is Navarro, 315. 3:15. Go ahead. The missing child, 415 Alpha, the one reported by a Marcus Slade at the Telluride ski village. Is he 1020? Negative, 3:15. That's an active search. Father is at the lodge, organizing search parties. We have half the county. Kate clicked the radio off. She looked at Silas, her face pale. He's at the resort, Silas, right now. He reported Leo missing an hour ago. He waited until he thought the boy was dead, until the storm covered his tracks, and now he's playing the victim. Silas's blood ran cold. The man wasn't just a killer, he was an artist. He'd left his son to freeze to death and was now drinking hot chocolate in a ski lodge, surrounded by sympathetic witnesses. Except the boy wasn't dead. He was here. And the man who tried to murder him now knew, thanks to Kate's radio call, that his plan had failed. The sick, cold realization hung in the cabin, more chilling than the air outside. Kate Navarro stood frozen, the radio in her hand suddenly feeling like a dead weight. Marcus Slade was here. Not a distant threat in Denver, but here, in Telluride, less than 10 miles away, surrounded by people, playing the part of a frantic, grieving father. He was insulated by sympathy, orchestrating a massive search for a child he had already left for dead. He's controlling the narrative, Silas said, his voice a low growl, giving voice to Kate's thoughts. He waited for the storm. He dumped the kid, waited just long enough for hypothermia to be irreversible. Then he drives to the ski village, establishes his alibi, and reports the missing child. The storm covers his tracks. The search party finds a frozen body in the spring, a tragic accident. Kate looked pale, her breath fogging in the cold room. But he's not dead, she said, her voice hard. And you, Cy, you and your dog just blew up his entire plan, but he doesn't know it yet. She raised the radio, then hesitated, her thumb hovering over the transmit button. What's the play, Kate? Silas asked, already knowing the answer. I can't light him up over the air, she said, thinking aloud. This channel isn't secure. If he has a scanner, or if one of the search party volunteers has one, he'll hear it. He'll know the boy is alive, and he will bolt. He'll be in Mexico before we can get a warrant. So, what do? I stall, she said. I go back. I tell my team we have a possible lead, something unrelated I need to check on. I tell them to slow the search, expand the perimeter, anything to keep Marcus at the lodge, to keep him from panicking. She looked at Silas, her professional mask firmly in place, but her eyes were grim. We have a great case for financial fraud, for endangerment. But for attempted murder, he'll say the boy wandered off. He'll say he panicked and lied. He'll hire a team of Denver lawyers that will eat this department for lunch. Silas, we need the victim's testimony. We need him. She nodded toward the hearth. All this time, Leo had been a silent observer, a small, pale ghost in the center of the storm. He sat, his small spine rigid, his hands still buried in Maverick's fur. He was watching the two adults, his eyes wide and dark, absorbing their tension. Kate took a deep breath, holstered her radio, and moved. She was trained for this, for interviewing children. She crouched down, making herself small, keeping her hands visible. Hey, Leo, she said, her voice soft and even. My name is Kate. I'm a friend. The boy flinched, as if the sound of his own name was a blow. He pressed his face so hard into Maverick's neck that the dog let out a soft huff. Leo, I know you're scared, Kate continued gently, but the man who left you, we need to find him. Can you tell me what happened? Leo's body went absolutely rigid. He began to tremble, a silent, violent vibration that shook his small frame. He was shutting down, retreating to the cold, silent place where he had been found. Kate looked up at Silas, her face a mask of frustration and helplessness. She had failed. Silas watched her. He saw not just a cop failing to get a statement, but the same crushing, useless inadequacy he had felt sitting by Clara's hospital bed, watching her fade away, his words, his strength, all of it utterly useless. He was tired of being useless. He didn't move toward the boy. He simply sat down, heavily, on the cold wooden floor, cross-legged, putting himself on the same level as the child and the dog. He didn't look at Leo, he looked at Maverick. He put his large, calloused hand on the dog's broad head, and his thumb began to rub the space between the dog's ears. Maverick, he said, his voice a low rumble, not directed at anyone, just into the space. You did a good job, boy. You You found him. You didn't give up. He kept his eyes on the dog, letting the silence stretch, just the sound of his hand moving on the dog's fur. It's hard, isn't it? He murmured, as if to a confederate. Being small, when the world is so big and loud, and you're supposed to trust the big people. You're supposed to do what they say. Kate watched, holding her breath, understanding. This wasn't an interrogation. It was something else. Sometimes, Silas continued, his voice thick with a truth he hadn't spoken aloud in years. Sometimes the people you trust, they hurt you. They make you feel small. They make you feel like you're in the way, like you're a burden. At that word, burden, a tiny hitched sound came from the pile of blankets. It was the smallest gasp of air. Silas didn't react. He just kept petting his dog. They make you feel like it's your fault, he whispered, his gaze distant, seeing a hospital room, not a cabin. But it's not. It's not your fault. You're just a kid. And then it happened. A tiny voice, no louder than a snowflake hitting the glass, emerged from the fur of Maverick's neck. He said, "Mama was sleeping too long." Silas and Kate froze. Neither of them moved. Neither of them breathed. Leo hadn't lifted his head, but he had spoken. His voice was a tiny, reedy whisper, directed only at the dog. He said, the voice trembled, "I was a bad boy. I was a burden." The word hung in the air, a terrible, poisonous thing. I spilled the milk. He got loud. Silas closed his eyes. He saw the purple bruise on the boy's wrist in his mind. "We went for a ride," he said. "We were playing a game, hide and seek, in the truck." A single hot tear rolled down Leo's cheek and disappeared into Maverick's fur. The dog whined just once and licked the side of the boy's head. He said, "Don't come out till I find you." He said to be a good boy and wait. The small body was shaking. He didn't come back," Leo whispered. "I got so cold. He didn't come back." As the boy spoke, his blanket had slipped. His small hand, the one not holding the dog, was exposed. In the harsh light of the lantern, Kate's sharp clinical gaze locked onto it. The purple and yellow, finger-shaped bruise on his wrist was stark and undeniable. She looked up and met Silas's eyes. He saw the cold, hard fury in her gaze. This wasn't just abandonment. This wasn't just attempted murder. This was a pattern. This was abuse. And they now had the victim's testimony, whispered into the fur of a hero. The whisper hung in the air, an indictment so pure and terrible that it seemed to suck the warmth from the room. Leo's small, trembling confession, delivered into the fur of the German shepherd, had solidified everything. Kate Navarro's face was a mask of cold fury. She looked at Silas, her eyes hard. "That's it," she said, her voice a low, controlled clip. "That's the ball game. Abuse, neglect, abandonment, attempted murder. The bruise on his wrist, the testimony, he's done." She keyed her radio, but not for the channel she'd used before. She switched to a secure, encrypted tactical channel, one she knew was monitored only by her most trusted dispatch. "Dispatch, this is 3 of 15, priority." A clipped, professional voice responded. "Send 317, Deputy Alston, to the Telluride Mountain Village, main lodge. I want him to locate a guest named Marcus Slade. He is a party to an active search, not a suspect. Alston is to approach him, inform him that we have a significant development and that I need to speak with him personally. He is to ride with Alston to my 20. She gave the coordinates to Silas's cabin. "Copy that, 315, the dispatcher said. "ETA for 317 at the lodge is 10 minutes. At your 20, maybe 30. "Alston?" Silas asked, raising an eyebrow as Kate clipped the radio back to her vest. "He's young," Kate said, pulling her gloves on with sharp, angry tugs. "But he's steady, and he's built like a linebacker. Slade won't give him any trouble, not while he's still playing the victim." She looked around the cabin, at the splintered door. "We're going to play this smart. No sirens, no guns drawn. Slade thinks he's coming up here to identify a backpack we found. He thinks he's coming to meet an uncooperative hermit who might have seen something." "And the boy?" Silas looked at Leo, who had retreated back into his silence, exhausted by his own confession. "He stays right there, with Maverick," Kate said. "Slade doesn't know the boy is here. That's our ace. We confront him with the physical evidence first. We watch him lie. Then," her voice turned to ice. "We show him the ghost." The next 30 minutes were the longest of Silas's life. He busied himself, reinforcing the door with a 2x4, his movements methodical, but his senses were screaming. He was back on the job. The quiet, grieving hermit was gone, replaced by the predator-like focus of the K9 handler. He could feel Maverick's tension too. The dog hadn't settled. He was sitting in a formal guard position by the hearth, his body a rigid, coiled spring, watching the door. The whine of 2 snowmobiles approached. Silas moved to the window. He saw Kate's machine, followed by a second, larger one. Kate was waiting. The second driver, a young deputy with a robust build and a face still new to the harshness of the job, dismounted. This was Alston. And then the passenger dismounted, Marcus Slade. Even from 50 yards away, the man was an image of contrived grief. He wore a single-piece matte black ski suit that must have cost more than Silas's truck. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and his face, when he looked up at the cabin, was a mask of strained, anxious agony. He was, as Silas had noted, an artist. Kate met him at the base of the porch. Silas could hear their voices through the door. "Mr. Slade, thank you for coming," Kate said, her voice all professional sympathy. What did you find?" Slade's voice was a masterpiece of controlled panic, hoarse and trembling. "Is it Leo? Did you find him?" "We found some items, sir, near this cabin. The man who lives here, he found a backpack. We need you to look at it." Kate led him to the door. Silas stood near the fireplace, his arms crossed. He made himself look like what Kate had called him, a large, uncooperative hermit. The door opened. Marcus Slade stepped inside, bringing a gust of cold air and the expensive, faint scent of cologne. He looked exactly like his driver's license photo, handsome, confident, his features symmetrical and strong, but now they were arranged in a performance of despair. "Officer, what is this?" he began, his eyes scanning the room, expecting what? A dirty bag on a table? He saw Kate. He saw Deputy Alston filling the doorway. He saw Silas, a large, bearded shadow by the fire, and then he saw the dog, Maverick, who had not moved, but whose low, vibrating growl was now audible, a sound like distant thunder. "Sir, calm your dog," Alston said, his hand moving toward his sidearm. "He's fine," Silas said, his voice flat. And then, Marcus Slade's gaze followed the dog's. He looked past Maverick, at the hearth, at the small pile of blankets, and he froze. It wasn't relief, it wasn't joy. It was the absolute blood-draining chemical shock of a man seeing a ghost. His performance, so perfect, so practiced, shattered into a million pieces. His face, a moment ago a mask of paternal anguish, went slack with a horror that was pure and undisguised. He wasn't seeing his son. He was seeing his life sentence. "Leo," he breathed, the name a poisoned hiss. He had seen the impossible. He had seen his plan fail. Leo, who had been hidden, turned his face. He saw Marcus. The boy didn't scream. He didn't cry. He simply went as white as the snow outside and began to shake. What is this?" Marcus stammered, his eyes darting between the cops, the hermit, and the child. He was trying to recalculate, to find a new lie. You kidnapped him!" he shrieked, pointing at Silas, the new narrative forming instantly. "You took my son!" "He was found in the derelict truck on the spur road, Mr. Slade," Kate said, her voice cutting through his panic. "He was left there. I don't know what you're talking about. We were skiing. He wandered off." "Then how?" Kate said, calmly walking to the table and lifting the blue Paw Patrol backpack. "Did this end up in a rocky crevice a mile from that truck, with this inside?" She dropped the wallet on the table. The slap of the leather hitting the wood was as loud as a gunshot in the silent room. Marcus Slade looked at the wallet. He looked at the boy. He looked at the 2 deputies. And he knew. The game was over. His entire carefully constructed world, the money, the inheritance, the new life, was gone. And it was all because of the 5-year-old child by the fire. His face contorted, the handsome mask melting away to reveal something ugly, primal, and cornered. "He's my son!" he screamed, a desperate final gambit. "I'm taking him!" He didn't lunge for Kate. He didn't lunge for Silas. He lunged for Leo, a desperate, animalistic move to grab his accuser, his evidence, his last tiny hostage. It was the last mistake he would ever make. He never saw it coming. Silas didn't even have to shout. The threat was overt. The K9's protected target, Leo, was attacked. Hit, Silas commanded, the word sharp and final. Maverick was a 90-pound sable missile. He launched from the hearth, clearing the space in a single bound, his body low and powerful. He met Marcus mid-lunge. It was not a bite to maul, it was a bite to apprehend. His jaws locked onto Slade's forearm, the one reaching for the boy. The man screamed, a high-pitched sound of pain and shock, as Maverick's momentum and weight slammed him backward, clean off his feet and into the cabin wall. Kate and Alston were on him instantly, guns drawn. On the ground! Do not move! Get your hands behind your back! Now! Marcus was sobbing, trying to fight the dog, but Maverick held his bite, his body rigid, pinning the man's arm to the floor until Silas grabbed his collar. Out! Silas commanded. The dog released instantly, his muzzle flecked with blood, and sat calmly at Silas's heel, breathing hard, his duty done. Marcus Slade, the sophisticated, grieving father, lay handcuffed on the floor, his expensive ski suit torn, his mask gone, revealing the snarling, pathetic creature beneath. The cabin was shockingly silent. The high-pitched, manic screaming of Marcus Slade had been replaced by the broken, guttural sobs of a defeated animal. Kate Navarro, her face like carved stone, read him his Miranda rights, her voice sharp and contemptuous, each word a nail in his coffin. Deputy Alston, built like the mountain he stood on, hauled Slade to his feet. The man was a wreck, his expensive ski suit torn and smeared with blood from Maverick's non-lethal, apprehending bite. You can't, Slade wept, a pathetic final attempt at control. I have lawyers. Get him out of my cabin, Silas said, his voice a low rumble. Alston nodded, dragging the man out into the blinding, pristine snow toward the snowmobiles. The confrontation was over. The violence was done. But in the cabin, the trauma lingered. Silas turned, his heart hammering, the adrenaline from the hit command still pulsing through him. He looked at the hearth. Leo hadn't moved. He was still sitting, his small back rigid, his hands still fisted in Maverick's fur. He had watched it all, the shouting, the lunge, the violent takedown. He was just watching. His face was pale, but his eyes, they weren't terrified. They were wide, stunned, and for the first time, curious. He had just seen the monster that haunted him, the big person, be utterly, physically dominated by another. Kate stepped back inside, pushing her braid back from her face. She looked exhausted. Okay, she breathed, keying her radio. 3:15 to dispatch. Suspect in custody. Transporting to county. And, we are 1010 with the child. He's safe. She turned to Silas. Child Protective Services are scrambling. I've got a social worker waiting in town. We need to take him down. Silas looked at Leo. At the mention of strangers, the boy's fragile composure cracked, his lip trembling. Silas shook his head. No. Kate paused. Si, that's the procedure. He needs to be evaluated. He is evaluated, Silas said, his voice firm. He's a material witness in an attempted murder case. He's a victim of aggravated kidnapping. He's not just a lost kid, and he trusts the dog. He stays with the dog. He stays with me. It was an unheard-of breach of protocol, but Kate looked at the boy clinging to the K9 and then at the imposing, rock-solid man who had just saved him. She nodded. Okay, Si, your call. But you're on the hook. I'm taking your official statement as soon as we're in town, and I am making the call to Denver PD. This just became a state-level case. While Alston drove a cuffed and whining Slade down the mountain, Kate, Silas, Leo, and Maverick each rode in Kate's larger utility snowcat. Leo, bundled and silent, sat not with Silas, but in the small space with Maverick, his hand never leaving the dog. The call Kate made from her office an hour later was the one that broke the dam. She wasn't just talking to a dispatcher. She was on a recorded priority line with a lead detective in the Denver PD's Homicide Assault Unit. Detective, this is Deputy Navarro, San Miguel County. You're not going to believe this, but your suspicious brake failure case involving Aria Davenport, we just found the motive, alive and well. And we have the primary suspect, Marcus Slade, in custody for the attempted murder of the heir. The detective in Denver, a grizzled veteran named Corbin, who had been stuck on the case for 2 months, was silent. Say that again, Deputy. She did, and she told him about Leo, about the truck, about the backpack, about the whisper. Within an hour, the stalled investigation into Aria Davenport's accident exploded. Armed with Leo's testimony, Denver PD had probable cause. They didn't just reopen the case, they tore it open. They had warrants for Slade's financials, for the black box data from Aria's wrecked car. They had a living, breathing victim who could testify to years of abuse and a final, brutal act. The case against Marcus Slade was no longer circumstantial. It was a tidal wave. But one piece of protocol remained. The hospital. Aria Davenport was still a patient. The detectives, along with a child advocacy lawyer, went to Denver General. They had to speak to Aria's designated medical guardian. They were met by a nurse in her late 50s, a woman named Beth Jessup, who had the pragmatic, tired eyes of someone who had seen too much. "She has no guardian," Nurse Jessup said, her voice clipped. Her husband, Mr. Slade, was her proxy, but her lawyers revoked that 2 weeks ago, citing irregularities. Right now, the hospital ethics board is technically in charge. Why? The detective explained, in flat professional tones, that Marcus Slade had been arrested, that Aria's son, Leo, was alive and safe. Nurse Jessup's professional mask cracked. "Oh my God," she whispered. She had been the one who sat with Aria for months. She was the one who held the phone, playing voicemails from a concerned but distant family. Does she know?" The detective frowned. "She's in a coma, nurse." "Doesn't mean she's not in there," Jessup snapped, a sudden, fierce loyalty flaring up. "We talk to her every day. It's part of the program." The detective, at a loss, just nodded. "Well, the child is safe. That's the message." Later that evening, long after the detectives had gone, Nurse Jessup was on her shift. She went into the quiet, dimly lit room. Aria Davenport lay still, pale and thin, her rich, dark auburn hair a stark contrast to the white pillows. She looked like a porcelain doll, beautiful and broken. The rhythmic beep of the monitors was the only sound. Jessup sat beside her, as she always did, and took her hand. "Aria," she said softly, her voice thick, "I don't know if you can hear me, but I have some news. It's about your son. It's about Leo." The monitors didn't change. "They found him, dear. He wasn't lost in an accident. He was found today. He's safe. He's alive, Aria. Your boy is safe." She squeezed the limp hand. Nothing. A tear rolled down the nurse's cheek. She sighed, patting the hand. "You just rest, dear. He's safe." She stood up and turned to check the IV drip. A sound stopped her. Not a beep. A sound from the bed. A dry, rasping, unfamiliar sound. A cough. She spun around. Aria Davenport's eyelids were fluttering. A violent, spastic tremor. Her fingers, which had been limp, were now curled into a fist. A moment later, a low, agonizing moan escaped her lips as her eyes, the same deep blue as her son's, cracked open for the first time in 2 months. The news had done what 2 months of medicine could not. The mother had heard the call of her child. It took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of agonizing physical therapy, of police interviews, of legal battles. But finally, a private medical van, flanked by a Telluride sheriff's car, made the long drive up the mountain, back to Silas's cabin. Silas had refused to let Leo go. The boy, the dog, and the hermit had become an inseparable, silent unit. Silas stood on his porch when the van arrived, his arms crossed. Leo was just inside the door, his hand, as always, on Maverick. Kate helped the nurse open the side door. A wheelchair was lowered. Aria Davenport was pale and painfully thin, her auburn hair cut short, but her eyes were bright, fierce, and wet with tears. She was wrapped in a blanket, but she was here. "Leo," she called out, her voice still weak but desperate. Leo, inside the cabin, froze. He knew that voice. He had only heard it in dreams. He let go of Maverick. He walked slowly to the splintered doorway. He peered out. He saw the woman in the chair. He just stared. She was so thin. Her hair was different, but it was her. "Mama," he whispered. "Oh, Leo," Aria sobbed, holding out one shaking, frail hand. "My baby, I'm here." He didn't run. He walked, his small boots heavy on the wooden porch, then faster. He reached the wheelchair and buried his face in her lap, his small hands grabbing the wool blanket, his body shaking with sobs. "Mama," he cried, the word a release, a triumph. "You woke up! You woke up!" Aria clutched his head, her tears soaking his hair. "I heard you. she whispered. "I heard you were safe. I came back." Silas watched from the doorway, his own eyes burning, his heart, which he had thought long dead, aching with a profound, painful beauty. Maverick walked past him, onto the porch, and sat beside the wheelchair. He nudged Arya's frail hand with his broad head. Arya, her hand still on her son's head, looked at the dog, and then up, at the huge, bearded, intimidating man in the doorway. "You," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You're the ones. You're my angels. You saved him." The reunion on the porch was the day the snow began to feel different. It was the moment the glacier in Silas Thorne's chest finally began to crack. Winter didn't just end in the San Juans, it broke. It shattered in a violent, messy thaw, with the sound of cracking ice and the roar of meltwater. The world, which had been a tomb of silent white, was reborn in a torrent of mud, debris, and, eventually, a shocking, vibrant green. For weeks, Silas's cabin was an island, not of snow, but of procedure. Detectives from Denver, lawyers, child service advocates, they all made the trek up the muddy, thawing road. Silas, Leo, and Maverick were a strange, silent triumvirate at the center of the storm. Leo spoke, but only when he had to, and usually only to Kate Navarro, or, in a quiet murmur, to Maverick. But his testimony, corroborated by Arya's, who had woken with a perfect, horrifying memory of the accident, and the digital evidence pulled from Slade's financials and Arya's car, was a deluge. Marcus Slade, the handsome, smiling artist of deceit, was buried, faced with a mountain of evidence, including the attempted murder of a minor and the attempted murder of his wife, and a jury pool that would see Leo's bruised wrist in their sleep. He collapsed. He took a plea deal that would ensure his perfectly styled hair would turn gray and then white behind the concrete walls of a Supermax facility. The legal battle was a distant, grinding noise. The healing was what happened on the mountain. Arya, with the kind of wealth that could move mountains, could have gone anywhere. She could have hidden in Europe or retreated to a sterile, high-security compound in California. She chose Telluride. She bought a simple, elegant log home in the valley, a place with massive windows that looked up toward the very ridges where her son had been found. It was an act of defiance, of reclaiming the landscape that had tried to steal her child. But the house in the valley wasn't the center. The cabin was. Spring had now fully arrived, a raw, sweet-smelling season of renewal. Silas was outside, his sleeves rolled up, revealing the corded, powerful forearms of his old life. He was mending the splintered door, the wood grain smooth and new under his calloused hands. The cabin, once a monument to his grief, was now just a house, and it was rarely empty. You're not throwing it right." The voice, still small but now high and indignant, was Leo's. He was standing in the clearing, his face, once waxy and blue, now flushed with sun and frustration. He was still small for his age, but he stood tall. "I am throwing it," Silas rumbled, not looking up from his work. "He's just not bringing it back." "Because he knows you're not playing." Maverick, the 90-pound retired K9, a creature of narcotic searches and bite work, had a bright red jwabber-covered ball at his feet. He looked bored. "He's not a play dog, Leo," Silas said, sanding a rough edge. "He's a working dog. He needs a job." "His job is playing," Leo insisted. He marched over, picked up the ball, and waved it. "Maverick, ball!" The dog's ears perked. Leo faked a throw, and Maverick, trick-eyed, launched forward before realizing his error, stopping with a grunt of canine disgust. Leo dissolved into a fit of high-pitched giggles. Silas paused, his hand still on the wood. He had never heard that sound before, not in this place. It was the sound of a life that had been saved, a sound he had thought impossible. "Okay," Silas said, standing up, wiping sawdust on his jeans. "You're right. I'm doing it wrong. Show me." For the next hour, Silas Thorne, the man who had trained his dog to find hidden drugs and armed felons, was schooled by a 5-year-old on the finer points of fetch. He learned the correct high-energy tone, the pre-throw wiggle, and the good boy scratch. And Maverick, the serious German shepherd, seemed to shed years, his movements no longer just patrol, but joy. The rumble of a truck interrupted the lesson. Kate Navarro's official sheriff's vehicle, caked in mud, pulled up, but she wasn't in uniform. She was in jeans and a Telluride local brewery hoodie, her dark hair in a simple ponytail. She was carrying a cardboard box that smelled of coffee and fresh baking. "Morning, fellas," she said, her sharp eyes taking in the scene. "Teaching the old man new tricks, Leo?" "He's a bad student," Leo said seriously, before running back to Maverick. Kate handed Silas a steaming coffee. "Heard the final sentencing came down on Slade," she said quietly, leaning against the porch rail. "Life, no parole. They threw the book at him, and the book's publisher, and the entire library." "Good," Silas said, sipping the coffee. It was hot and real. "Good," Kate agreed. She looked at him, her gaze softer than it had been in the winter. "You know, when I first transferred here, you were the local ghost story, Silas. The broken-hearted K9 cop who went up the mountain to die. Now," she nodded at the door, "Arya is bringing a lasagna up for dinner, Leo is retraining your $1 million K9, and you're, I don't know, sanding." Silas looked at the door he was fixing. It was broken. "Yeah, it was," Kate said, smiling. "We all were." That evening the cabin was full. Arya, whose pale, thin frame had regained its strength, her dark auburn hair growing back thick and lustrous, was laughing at something Kate said. Leo was asleep on the hearth, his feet tangled in Maverick's fur, the dog's head rising and falling with the boy's breathing. The cabin, which had been a cold, silent prison for 3 years, was filled with the smell of garlic bread, the low murmur of conversation, and the steady, rhythmic breathing of a child. Silas sat in his old chair, watching the flames. He thought of Clara. The old, sharp, stabbing guilt was still there, but it was joined by something else, a profound sense of duty. He had failed to save her, a failure that had driven him into the wilderness. But the wilderness had brought him these people. He hadn't just saved Leo. Leo and Arya and even Kate had saved him. They had stormed his perimeter of grief, breached his defenses, and refused to leave. He looked at the child asleep by the fire, protected by the dog. His old life was defined by a perimeter he patrolled to keep the bad out. He realized, as he looked at the family he had accidentally built, that his new life was defined by the perimeter he now kept to keep the good in. It was a smaller, stronger, and infinitely warmer circle, a watchman's cabin that had, against all odds, finally become a home. Sometimes the miracles we pray for don't arrive with the sound of trumpets or a flash of lightning. They arrive in the middle of an impossible blizzard with the stubborn bark of a loyal dog. God's plan is often written in the snow, in the places we feel most lost. He didn't just send Maverick to find a child who was freezing. He sent a child to find a man who was frozen in his own grief. Silas thought he was saving Leo, but in the end, that little boy and that faithful K9 were the ones who rescued him. In our own lives, we all face storms. We face seasons of impossible cold, of loneliness and pain, where we feel trapped and abandoned. But this story is a reminder: do not give up. Your miracle might be just on the other side of the noise. Perhaps God is calling you to be someone else's Maverick, to be the loyal friend, the unexpected rescuer who refuses to give up. Perhaps He is calling you to be like Silas, to open your broken heart just one more time. You never know whose life you are meant to save. If this story of faith, loyalty, and second chances touched your heart, please share it with someone you know who needs a reminder that hope is real. Comment below and tell us which part of this story, Silas's redemption or Maverick's loyalty, moved you the most. And please, subscribe to our channel for more true stories that warm the heart and strengthen the soul. Thank you for watching. May God bless you. May He keep you safe in your own storms. And may He always send a guardian to find you in the snow. Amen.